responsibility, those forms of paid labor associated with public manual work most definitely do not, and are precisely the signs of lack of social status, from the rural agricultural labor to the urban construction worker. Notice that all of these are forms of paid work. This is why it is not enough to offer a gender or even a class analysis of women's paid and unpaid work in our context. As Meera Vilayathan has argued several decades ago, the overwhelming proportion of women's paid work has been subject to the stigma of being lower caste. Apart from its onerous and vulnerable nature, it also marks the lower caste working body as sexually available to men of all castes. This is how a contrast comes to be drawn with the dependent, unpaid labor of other women who nonetheless hope to avoid such sexual and caste stigmatization by their withdrawal from the public domain of paid work and protection within the institution of marriage. Another theorist has looked at patterns of women's labor participation by education and caste in contemporary India. In the statistical picture that emerges, Dalit and Adivasi women predominate both among those with no education and who labor out of necessity. Middle and upper caste with education up to primary levels of schooling and with employed husbands opt out of the labor force. Only with further education, where predominantly upper castes are to be found, is there a small, if positive, correlation with work. So this produces, and so-called lower caste, backward caste, Muslim women are all caught in this very central level where they're completely invisible within India's working population. So if one were to plot women's labor participation in relation to education and income in a graph form, what you get is a kind of famous U. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the famous U, where there are high level, relatively speaking, slightly high levels at the low end of poverty and lack of education. It then drops hugely and it begins to rise a little bit. It rises a little bit at the higher end of the people like us at the very high end of the spectrum can expect to find some avenues for labor, some but small. So, and keep in mind that the entire thing still adds up to only 15%. And by the way, this U pattern is unique to India. It does not exist anywhere else in the world with the exception perhaps of West Asia. And I think we all would like to think that we're much better in treating our women than what happens in West Asia, Middle East, okay? So in the rest of the world, there is a simple upward, that is to say, with greater education, with more, slightly better class background, you have more work chances. More women enter the employed sector. Only in India do we have this backward, do we have this downwards kind of pattern. And it seems to me that this is the problem that we have yet to find an adequate understanding of. And furthermore, that this pattern has not changed in any appreciable way in this era of so-called inclusive growth, or whatever you want to call it, the last 20 years has seen no change in this particular pattern. This is why one must underscore that only a tiny segment of overwhelmingly urban upper caste women have gained entry into a workforce with no connection to a laboring body, who may therefore work without social stigma, including the ever-shrinking formal sector and the more globalized enclaves such as the financial, media and entertainment industry, though this by no means precludes other gendered and sexual forms of harassment. So this really calls for a much more careful understanding and analysis than I think we have offered so far. How then do we square a labor theory of value with a stigma theory of labor, the very negation of value, whose fullest contradiction is embodied by Dalit women? There is a further flaw in most theorizations of the domestic sphere, whose common assumption is that the sexual gender division of labor within it can be analyzed outside the market and its logic. Here it becomes necessary to pause and recognize that the domestic sphere is both a familial sphere and a household, that the domestic sphere is not outside the market, but is rather co-constructed by it. Let us revisit the list of activities mentioned earlier: cooking, cleaning, childcare. One cannot but notice that these labors are as much structured by lasting personal relationships within the family as they are by paid domestic work, albeit to varying degrees and in historically changing forms. Or to put this differently, the reproduction of class hierarchies through the family requires the differentiation of women's domestic labor into those who can lay claim to the assistance of paid domestic work and those who cannot do so. Rajni Baldiwala and Neeta N have called this social structure stratified familialism. Cooks, housemaids, babysitters or child carers, these are all clear occupational categories for which wages are paid. Notice further that over the last decade, paid domestic work has risen the most in urban India, whose only other competitor in salaried work is primary school teaching. I don't know if you know this, but in urban India in the last 20 years, the two top, we all think it could be media and financial services and all these more hip kinds of job opportunities. But number one is primary school teaching, thanks to Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, and number two is paid domestic work, last 20 years, all right? So thus the normative household extends well beyond the domain of the familial and indeed makes the normative family possible. While the history of various forms of servitude was a well-known aspect of pre-modern households the world over, it is interesting that with the rise of the women's movement and feminism, one of whose breakthroughs was to expose the oppressions of the home through housework and the sexual division of labor, servants were largely conspicuous by their absence. One might even want to speculate on the seeming disappearance of the black servant from white middle-class households in post-World War II United States, including the extent to which Betty Friedan's conceptualization of the problem with no name. I don't know if you know, Betty Friedan wrote this book called The Feminine Mystique in the 1960s, where she was trying to understand what was it about the US urban middle-class housewife of the 1960s, why was she not the happiest of all people, why was she having mental breakdowns, why was she facing all manner of problems, which she calls the problem with no name, because there was no obvious reason as to why she should have a problem. And I'm not saying this is the answer at all, I'm simply saying that if we look at the problem of with no name suffered by the American suburban housewife, maybe it was not simply a crisis of marriage and family ideology, but equally due to the loss of the black women who did everything from cooking multi-course dinners, cleaning the house, to taking care of young children. Having earlier highlighted the contradictory realm of women's public labor outside the home through the conflicted lens of stigma and value, I am now trying to get at the peculiar nature of the domestic normative realm, where wives render their labor lovingly, seemingly outside the circuits of exchange value, but actually not. For there is a market wage for housework already in place, whose bottom end is amongst the most exploitive imaginable. When we keep asking ourselves about the persistent non-recognition of women's work in the home, my wife doesn't work, my mother doesn't work, say patriarchal husbands and their children to this very day. But perhaps we are simultaneously forgetting the labors of those that are even deeper in the shadows, whose devaluation, in my view, is part of the overall problem of valuing domestic labor itself. An essential aspect of this overall devaluation, of course, is that their domestic spaces need not count for anything in comparison to ours. This is the humiliation and failure every domestic worker knows, as she combines poorly paid domestic work in the household of others together with unpaid labor in her own. It is my further submission here that this complex domestic relation of power and exploitation that results in making the unpaid oppressed housewife the quote-unquote employer of the paid servant, that this requires structures of non-economic forms of discrimination under modern capitalism, race and ethnicity in most parts of the world, caste in India. The question of what kinds of paid domestic work are done by what castes in whose households and at what wages deserves detailed analysis. But I can probably risk the provisional generalization that the most ubiquitous and basic work of cleaning other people's homes is a lower caste, if not Dalit, occupation. I would further venture to say that the very decades of globalization, which have witnessed some mobility for dominant middle castes and much more for sections of urban upper castes, along with a significant reduction in their fertility patterns, in other words, huge reduction in the number of children that they have, has led to a marked increase in individualization and intensification of personal relationships between husband and wife, and increasingly in the bringing up of children. All this is placing unprecedented and enormous demands on such women to the extent of pushing even the tiny segment of those with quote-unquote good jobs to consider giving them up. Further reinforcements can be found in contemporary capitalist workplaces, the media, and right-wing ideologies. At the same time, the sustainability of the new family requires an increase in paid domestic services. Consider the growing market for provisioning Adivasi women as living maids in many North Indian cities, or again the rise in various levels of nursing care for the elderly, especially in the demographically aging southern states. So let me now return to the list of household tasks mentioned earlier on in this essay and the missing item, sexual services, and the relationships of love and intimacy that are becoming violence, discrimination, and exploitation. Questions of love and sex and their fundamental underpinning of these institutions has received more sustained critique from queer perspectives. What makes these aspects of the domestic realm so difficult to discuss? One radical answer could be that this is because they belong within the realm of the pure relationship, carried by eros and affect, and does not work at all. Perhaps. But there are signs that today's companionate couple might be closer to inhabiting the world so hilariously and yet starkly described by Laura Kipnis as, and this is the phrase that she uses, surplus monogamy. Surplus monogamy refers to all the surplus labor that has to go into the creation and sustenance of sexual intimacy, the extra hours, the renunciations, the sheer labor of it all. No other aspect of lasting personal relationships has been more romanticized or subjected to silence, while perhaps sharing considerably more with Marx's discussion of the onerous production of surplus value in Volume 1 of Capital than has been allowed for. And I'm joking, of course, but I'm saying it's a serious joke. While this may well be part of the intractability of this domain, I would also like to suggest that a fundamentally related aspect is due to the enormous distance that today separates the normative domestic sphere from the world of sex work. This is in some contrast to earlier times, where the historical record amply attests to the open yoking of procreative and non-procreative sexualities, so-called good and bad women in the colonial times, including the highest social status that certain women could achieve, as in the Devadasi tradition of southern India, and the greater visibility in general of prostitution in social life, which lasted well into the early decades of the 20th century of colonial India. Also consider the Marxist feminist Alexander Kollontai, for one, who could not imagine liberation without socializing household labor, as well as critiquing both marriage and prostitution as part of the same system of control, so much so that no genuine change was possible without addressing both these institutions in the same frame. There are few contexts or struggles today where such sexual relations, even if hierarchized, are nonetheless talked about or criticized together. Contemporary debates over prostitution and sex work, and especially trafficking, rarely feel the need to bring the institution of marriage into their analytical or political grid. While the paid domestic worker is part of the reproduction of the household, but her exploitation rendered invisible within it, prostitution is thought to be segregated from the rest of society under constant threat of abolition. I have been trying to theorize women's labor in the Indian context by indicating the extent to which it is shot through with contradictions. There are the contradictions of caste, which render paid labor as stigma and vulnerability rather than value and autonomy. The contradictions of class, whereby the ubiquity of the caring domestic sphere must include its co-construction through the market of paid domestic work. And finally, there is the objective sphere of sex work. So in other words, what I want to conclude by saying is that if we want to find a better way of naming the problem of women's labor, then this may be one of the ways to do that. To say the only way I feel that we can name the problem of women's labor in our country would be to show these intersectional grids of caste, class, and sexuality, which in the normal run of things are disappearing from our picture, but which perhaps in certain ways we can help to bring back to visibility. Thank you.
Question is in legal context, and what I wanted to know from you is what is your view in terms of when we talk about female accused. So there, when we see the speedy trial of fast track court, so is it in favor of the female accused when we have very short time period where the trial and judgment comes, or is it something somewhere hampering the quality when we talk about the judgment? So there is somewhere compromise with the quality. So what is your opinion on this?
I'm not a legal. I mean, I'm not the founder of all wisdom.
More in terms of when you talk about women and when we talk about we are talking about women labor.
Yes.
So this is one of the another parameter or sector, like when we talk about all the when we talk about women and their engagements in all other sector. So this is also something one which we need to focus. And
on what happens to her when she's an accused?
No,
when she's accused of a crime.
Yeah, so I'm talking about in terms of when I'm talking about women accused and the quality of judgment or trial which comes from the fast track court. So is there somewhere compromise with the quality or it is in favor? So that is what I
genuinely don't know how to answer your question because I don't have that experience and I've not researched that question. So I imagine there could well be biases against women as accused. I mean, but that I don't want to answer in fact. I don't want to give you a fact answer. That's not the style in which I think. So I won't try to answer your question. I haven't researched it to be able to answer that. And don't mention your name. It helps me a little bit to know.
Yes, sorry. Now that we have something called development and policy matrix under this new dispensation, and there is a growing realization that progressive vocabularies like security, safety, efficiency, all those things have been co-opted by this dispensation. The same those vocabularies which were cherished by progressive forces.
Could you bring it closer to your yes?
Same very vocabulary which have been cherished by progressive forces for very long under development and planning matrix, and during that time it was that the lower caste women were systematically eliminated from workforces, especially for example in extractive industries and all those areas where their participation was as high as 50% or more. Like how to look at the mainstream progressive struggles which have not taken account of this factor sufficiently.
No, yeah.
In your presentation, you mentioned that the two most popular sort of paid work that is coming up in the urban India is domestic work and education.
Primary school, yes.
Primary school education. So, and you elaborated quite at length the domestic labor and then at the end of the paper you talked about the intersectionality of class and caste, and we can very well understand that kind of intersectionality and impose that lens to understand domestic labor. But can we also use the same grid to understand education? That part of labor.
Okay.
I'm asking this because in private school, if you don't look at government school, in private school there is a particular preference to employ women teachers,
yes.
And there's a logic to it, so in that context I'm asking.
I have a question about intersectionality. Like when we take intersectionality as a particular categorization at a broader level based on the established policy indicators and the actual manifestation of intersectionality in the processes,
Yes.
the kind of qualitative and quantitative friction exists in these two processes. How do you view that, and how do you suggest research as a kind of instrument to bridge that?
So you're saying
what kind of scholarship particularly you suggest, the feminist scholarship?
Scholarship.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Lord Binna from Tata Institute of Social Science. My question is connecting feminism and geography. We were talking about the Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency at the time of colonization.
Yes.
But now when we see India, we are talking about Indian society. But in reality we see it's like United States of India. we are from very different background, the northeast, north
Yes.
and south.
Okay.
So in your studies, what type of variations this geographical geopolitics give to you?
Oh, it's a huge question. Mary, my question is about data sources. See, there is this confusion about women in the social sector, like the Asha and the Anganwadi workers, and there are judgments of the Karnataka High Court, for example, which says that the Anganwadi workers are not workers. Okay, now does the data? But the fact is that they're working and they get wages. So the data that you have used, in developing your paper, what is your experience? Does the data actually capture the labor of these women, or does it not? Because the kind of picture that we get would be different, in the workplaces. That is one. And secondly, sometimes the data can be deceptive because NSSO, the latest round, there is something about, the female-headed households. For example, in large metro cities like Delhi and Mumbai, and the indication is that these are recent migrants and, they have come in, possibly pushed because of forces of globalization. But our rationality, which we were discussing this morning, would also tell us that they would not be able to survive in cities like Bombay and Delhi if they were not working. But what kind of work do they do, and does the data source capture that? I mean, are you aware of that? Yeah.
Would you have any insights about the role and impact of the labor unions of domestic laborers in formalizing the nature of domestic labor employment?
All right, one more, then I'll.
Hi, I'm Vasudha from Tata Institute. I have a question about three intersections which you talked about: caste, class, and the notion of the abject.
Yeah.
In an earlier paper, I think about a year ago, you had mentioned about the concept of affect and the labor related to affect.
Somebody else.
Yeah. So I was confused about a lot of feminist scholarship there about looking at emotional surrogacy and looking at the notion of abject and looking at the concept of prostitution. So the way the notion of commercial surrogacy, for example, as a form of reproductive paid labor, especially with the growing proliferation of reproductive clinics across the country. So how would you look at, for example, the intersection here? Because most feminist scholarship within India would look at the larger context of, say, the constitution of subjectivity in relation to market, capital, and, the larger agenda of the state of not regulating such technology. And you also mentioned about the role of sexuality. So, for example, there's been a recent ban on gays coming to India to access surrogacy services.
Yes.
So we know about 377 and the gays of the state. But there are also intersections with, say, for example, problematizing institutions of medicine. And the gaze of looking at women in the particular service providing, body providing kind of thing. So how would intersectionality look at that?
Okay. Whole host of questions. On the question on whether or not we have paid enough attention to recent trends in terms of loss of work. I just say, and especially loss of work. I think the person who asked the question was indicating that there's been particularly lower castes and have suffered the most in terms of. So the first thing to say is that yes, there has been a decline. The decline that I mentioned, that and the decline has been across various sectors, both urban and rural. So have we given enough attention to the actual groups and their locations and their intersectionalities? Perhaps not. I mean, I think, in fact, those of you who work in this area, one of the things you should do is, I think Professor Elena Sen had mentioned the National Sample Survey, and we all know about the National Sample Survey because of the poverty line and all the ongoing debates about the poverty line. But I don't know whether you know that the National Sample Survey also asks for data, also seeks information from the people that they enumerate based on their, not just on their consumption expenditure, which is the way you measure poverty, but also their caste, their community as they reported to you. This means that you can actually, in a very interesting matrix, and somebody was asking about, what can we do in terms of scholarship. One of the things everybody can do today with the help of this data by doing unit level analysis, you can actually do a kind of interlocking matrix where you can find out in great detail upper caste, Muslim, urban, women or men or whatever. You can do this kind of intersectional analysis now for the first time because they ask whether you're SC, ST, OBC or upper caste, they ask your religion, and all of these can be combined together to produce very, very, very detailed and rich at regional levels, at state levels, at least not below the state. You can actually find out, we can actually find out by all these indicators who is in today's banking sector, who is in today's media sector, who is in today's agricultural sector, who is today doing domestic labor, in the range of that which is personalized, what's called under the section of personalized services. So yes, this information is available to us, it's available, it's public information by the state no less. The state no less is giving us this kind of data, but I feel it's one of the biggest public secrets. And one of the reasons I have talked about labor here and not violence is because I am beginning to fear that, and don't get me wrong, I think the opening up of issues of violence has been hugely significant and hugely important, and one that we should positively embrace as in the movement. Surely yes. But I sometimes fear that the saturation of public discourse on violence is actually at severe cost of bringing other aspects which in some senses are equally violent. In other words, how are, the question that Professor Sen was asking, how are people actually surviving in today's economies, urban or otherwise, is to me the biggest public secret of the present time, and it need not be such a public secret. There is actually data that the government is putting out, but which we are not actually accessing. So to me, that is absolutely critical. It could be done across sectors. So the fact in this paper I was showing more the extraordinary power that the domestic sphere could, if indeed 15% is a figure, the paid work figure is likely to be more right than wrong. I think as far as our data sets go, there's a lot we will not get, and that will be at the level of unpaid work. But I doubt whether an Anganwadi worker who is fighting for recognition from the state will, when the NSS person comes to her door, will she tell the NSS person, I am not receiving any kind of payment? I wonder, are we, these are questions that we can keep asking ourselves. And the only reason why I think we will fall back on NSS data more or less is that when we do micro studies, as some of us have done in my center in Delhi, we have done it, and I'm sure here at TIS we do a lot of these studies. When we do these studies, they don't really contradict. Beyond the point, they don't contradict these figures. We do discover which makes it a mystery. To come to your question, it's something of a mystery to me. How are, the urban paid rates in the city of Delhi is as low as 10%. It's not 15 is the national average. It's 10% in Delhi. I simply, to me, it's a mystery. How are people surviving? And there's not much you can hide behind. That's to my mind. So yes, we can bring intersectionality into education. Education, of course, is that rather traditional, we could say, is the traditional work for women because it exemplifies, or especially young children. It's not traditional work necessarily at the high school levels or beyond, but at the primary level, it's an extension of caring for children and therefore lends itself to being women's work. What would an intersectional framework yield might be very interesting, because my sense is that it may be one of the few areas, especially private schools, where you may have high levels of exploitation of young women, para-teachers especially, but many of them may well be upper caste. My hunch, many of them are upper caste, young women looking for maybe just a little bit of pocket money and are hyper exploited for those reasons, being employed as para-teachers in this sector where they're basically meant to be like a creche for these little children. How much of teaching they give them is anybody's guess. We do need, in other words, we need an intersectional analysis, including to find the upper caste identity as much as a lower caste. So it's not just about black women, it's also about white women. It's not just about lower caste, it's also about upper caste. What would this new educational sector yield in terms of opening up this to a genuinely intersectional analysis? The regional question, that's a huge question. I mean, yes, I think today, compared to the colonial era, we're in a much, much better state than we were then to open up women's question and the nature of the ways in which issues are emerging or not emerging, the cross-linking, the intersectional aspects of all of that. We're in a much better state today to do it from a regional perspective than we were before. And that's both because data sets are helping us, and also I think because there are groups in these regions who are doing this kind of work. So the question of the Northeast, or the question of Kashmir, or the question of the South, and so on, all these can today be opened up, and they have to be opened up not just at the level of data sources, but also at the level of the nature of the state in these places, the relationship that regions have to the nation state. In other words, just as when I was talking in my previous presentation about the dominance of Bengal, that historical dominance that Bengal may have had in terms of the colonial question and in terms of the women's question, today we can't speak of that kind of dominance. There's another kind of dominance, which is that of the nation state in its relationship to respective regions. And that is a very, very complex and a very, very important question. So it's not just what is the question in the Northeast, but what is the question in the Northeast vis-a-vis the role of the nation state, the Indian state in the Northeast, as well as whatever may be quote-unquote local about the Northeast. So I think that kind of work really needs to be done much more than ever before. I think the Anganwadi question, I've tried to answer it. I think we can never know what we are missing or not missing. That will always be, but I think the extent to which there are follow-up, the NSS has follow-up questions. It asks in great detail, are you looking for work, what kind of work? The whole range of questions is such that especially urban India, I do think it's more accurate in urban India. That's why it's so, how shall I say, so shocking when urban India gives us this extraordinarily bad picture. Also, micro-level analyses don't contradict them to the extent to which we do those pictures. What are unions doing? We have unions now for, I think, the last 10 years, domestic workers unions. How much are they doing? How much should they be doing? There's a minimum wage that many states have put out for domestic work. All those are important questions. I think I am also looking for ways in which we can bring the, and I think unionization is absolutely critical, but I would also encourage us to think more broadly. I mean, how do we think more broadly about the sphere of the domestic? In other words, this sphere in which we have this, the classic image is the unpaid housewife exploiting the paid domestic worker. This is a very interesting, complex dynamic in which the man is somewhere in the background, or not so much in the background, depending. But this dyad, this relationship, is one that I think historically and socially and economically is one that we should open up. As I said, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying. I think unions will hopefully, even in this very hostile climate, find ways in which to take questions forward. I think we, as feminists, ought to be looking at the question in all its this messy intersection that I am interested in more. How would we look at when we want housework to gain value? After all, that is what we keep talking about. Domestic work has no value. But what if that no value was a combination of the so-called love of the housewife and the hyper-exploitation of the domestic worker? If that combination is producing this devaluation, how do we tackle that? Right? So one part of that tackling might be unionizing, professionalizing domestic work. The other part would be a larger feminist politics about the domestic sphere itself and the nature of domestic work. So that's finally, the issue of commercial surrogacy is a it's a just emerging area. It throws up many questions. I think in some ways it throws up possibly more complex questions than sex work has thrown up. Okay, given the nature of what is involved in terms of a new life is involved, a baby is involved. It's not just about whether or not you engage in a sex act with a customer or not, or you have consensual relationships with a partner. That is one level. But I'm saying commercial surrogacy opens up the whole domain of labor in order to produce a child that in turn is going to be, in some sense, in a market. When we say commercial, it's going to be in a market determined by not just national and international forces, but by medicalization and medical technology and medical advances. So the range of players involved in terms of, the medical nature of the identity of a child, the industry involved. If it is international, then you have international parents in one part of the world and whatever, and our own having to think about it. I think the intersections here are huge. And I think we need, my only caveat would be that there are some analysis out there, and I think Kukum Sangari is one of them. I'm just mentioning that, not to say anything negative, but there are some analysis out there who simply say this is violence. Just as we said sex work was violence, commercial surrogacy is violence. I would hesitate. I would say that simply calling it violence is not helpful for our understanding. It may not even be particularly helpful for the future of those who are engaging in the trade, and it's least helpful, I think, in terms of trying to engage with the range of medical technology that is now part and parcel of this relationship. So I think infertility, you name it, all of these will require a much more, how shall I say, nuanced, slower, more careful kind of analysis, which I think in the coming years we're going to see in terms of actually coming to grips with the situation. It's also not about saying yes or no. Again, I'm not sure that that's like banning. I think that most of the time we want to either say yes or no. Let's ban this film, let's ban this book, let's ban this practice. I feel that when we're only thinking in terms of banning or not banning, it shows a certain lack on our side of engagement. Which is not to say that it's a great thing. I'm not trying to hold up commercial surrogacy or anything else, or a film may be bad or not bad. I'm saying that the gesture of thinking about banning as a response to a problem, like people want to ban surrogacy, right? And there are countries that do. I am suggesting that that will not help us to get to grips with what is going on. Okay, the first gentleman.
Famous economist John Robinson once remarked that the only thing worse than being exploited by the capitalist is not being exploited by the capitalist.
Yes.
So I often wonder, for example, during the periods of high economic growth, historically what we have seen is that women withdraw, or it seems that women withdraw from the labor force. It has happened in the post-war scenario in Europe and North America. It is happening now in India, which is now people are talking about, the missing women in the labor force in the last 2 rounds of NSS surveys. And this is also the period when there is high economic growth in India, more than 6% annually. And the second thing is also about the quality of jobs. For example, particularly the public health sector, if you look at, it's a very good example because, starting from full-time nurses to ANMs to Anganwadi workers to now Ashas, basically, progressively the work is becoming informal, unorganized, and also almost unpaid, because Ashas are supposed to be volunteers, and they are not, they are demand unions, but effectively they are paid nothing. I think the last time I heard it was 5,000 rupees a month. So these two questions of trying to also bring in the relationship between changing economy and the participation of women into the labor force, and how both the relationship between how high economic growth paradoxically leads to women withdrawing from the labor force, and the second thing about the reduction of good quality jobs. Organized sector employment increase is zero for last many years now. For last 1.5 decades, there is no growth in organized sector employment, men, women, everywhere. And within that, if you consider being an ANM, organized sector job, ANM would always be paid less than the nurse, which was supposed to be a full-time job in a public hospital. So, I don't know what is happening.
Yeah, no, I think you've described it quite well. You've described it very well, and this remains, therefore, this is the terrain that we have to traverse. So, So I think you brought in I didn't bring in enough of this peculiar new economy, this very strange road that we are traversing in India, quite unlike any other road, quite unlike the Chinese road, for instance, which is creating jobs. Our road is not creating jobs, and least of all not creating jobs for women. Yet you began with the Joan Robinson remark, which is in some sense an irony, because what is happening therefore, and here I think the work of people like Kalyan Sanyal and others is very important, is that we are living in a world where indeed large sectors, we live in a world where capitalism is putting large sections of the workforce outside of capital. In other words, it's exclusionary in that sense. And I think the huge proportion of women who occupy that space is very large. The only additional point I would make to what you're saying is that which groups of women are being excluded and why, or which women are actually stepping out, this withdrawal question. The withdrawal question needs an intersectional analysis. That's what I was suggesting here. The intersectional analysis might be that there is more than one reason. That's why I brought in the question of stigma, which I think we don't look at sufficiently. When indeed the labor is such that it is a source of degradation and not just exploitation, then withdrawal may also be in order to withdraw from humiliation of being in that form of public labor, which you're forced into by virtue of circumstance. So there could be an intersectional set of reasons. The other would be to say, if it is your upper middle class woman with a bank job or another kind of job who now is investing, I'm using the word almost, is investing in her children, is withdrawing from the labor force under the present circumstance, relying on the income of the husband, agreeing to become a dependent, but seeking her future through her children, and investing in extraordinarily with one or two, the new child norm, etc., one girl, one boy, whatever it may be, sex selection to make it just right. This new family, which I think is, Bombay is probably full of them, this new family in which you invest in every which way, doing homework, tuitions, taking the karate class, whatever else goes into the production of this new perfect child, who will be the future for that, and willing to therefore sacrifice whatever job satisfaction she may have had earlier. That kind of withdrawal under high growth is very different from the withdrawal or the loss of work that I think the person in the beginning was asking me about, where indeed in urban India, retail, many jobs that were available in this, as you say, this informal economy is almost everywhere. But those sets of jobs that were available in this informal economy are now getting lost. And for this group of women, the only work seems to be paid domestic work. She's not even going to become a primary school teacher. So if that is not an avenue for her, then she's withdrawing for very different sets of reasons. So I think the question we are left with then, and it does produce a great sense of distress for all of us, is what forms of politicization of each of these spheres do we need to think about? One is the unionization question. What is making unionization for women and for informal sector women more critical than ever before? I may have my differences with the SEVA model, for instance, the Self-Employed Women's Association model, but perhaps there are ways in which they are thinking about forms of collective action that may perhaps have some effect in this current kind of situation. Okay, what do we do about this new normative woman who, the most visible form of this new woman is in the US, is the tiger mom. I don't know if you've heard this phrase, the tiger mother, the tiger mom, yeah? Amy Chan, that is the new Asian Chinese woman who will kill for her children, will not do any other kind of work, will do whatever it takes to make sure that those children get into Harvard, right? So this new subject, what kind? This is a neoliberal subject of a very peculiar kind, but which is finding echoes in our own culture too. And I think that we may have less sympathy for her, and I think we don't have to have much sympathy for her. But on the other hand, she's also a product of this new time. So what are the ways in which then we need to politicize the realms of labor under these conditions? This is the question I would ask you to think about, because you painted it very well. Yeah, sure. And there's one last one there.
maybe then you are also raising a question for us over here. That your last point, that you build on that. That the need for some it is withdrawal, for some it's loss. So, or one is a more reluctant withdrawal, and one is a more choice-oriented withdrawal, if I may put it that way. So that is one. The other is your earlier point in response to the question, but I thought you were suggesting a question of complicity. That woman in the household and the domestic worker, and how we could be complicit in exploitation, stigmatization, and handing over our abject, our unwashed dishes to another woman to wash. So two questions then over here. One is the question of withdrawal and loss, which fractures, institutes some fracture among us. And the other is the question of complicity, which also in a way institutes a fracture. It relates to I think the major point you are making, that if in India we have to understand women's labor, women's work, we have to understand it through a triple axis, a mutually constitutive triple axis, exploitation, stigmatization, and the abject, where you bring in sex work, but even work of certain kinds which are not sex work could also be work around the abject. So people dealing with the social abject, all our abjected material. So in that sense, what it also raises for us is that there are, invisible fractures within these spaces in terms of who is dealing with the abject, who is the sex worker, how do we look at her, and who is the domestic worker. So in that sense, my feeling is that while you raise a framework for understanding women's work or women's labor in India today, and it's a very interesting framework, I think, and it's not that you have to answer all the questions. I was thinking, how do we bring the three to intersection or dialogue is a question, and so that you have to say it all. We also have to do some work. So, but it also raises this question about fracture.
Yes, I do. And in fact, one of the things that strike me as one of the most painful aspects of the fracture in the home is precisely the unpaid mother and the paid servant, where I have noticed, this may be anecdotal, but I have noticed that it is at its sharpest. The unpaid mother is at her sharpest in pushing the servant to do the maximum, in feeling that she is actually getting a bad deal. Those of us who enjoy the paid labor market are kinder, quote unquote, to our paid domestic servants. But I think we need a very careful analysis of the complicity and the fracture that is indeed characterizes this relationship. As that's where our feminism is on test. Because otherwise we could simply make this housewife into a bad human being. That would not do at all. That would be a terrible analysis of what in fact is going on. So this need, I don't have answers here, but I'm saying I'm putting it on the table for us to really open this up. I think there was one last, yes, and then we should, I think we're running out of time.
My question actually draws on the earlier question on the restructuring of the economy. I've been doing some work on this and also doing some reading on informalization.
Thinking out of this, into the mic.
Yeah. I've been reading recently and doing some work around informalization processes that we are seeing underway. And this phenomenon also of a lot of home-based manufacturing and different kinds of production, whether it's clips or zips or sewing or whatever the nature of it, but it's often done, it's done in the house and it's done by different groups, including women. And it actually then, so I think, so there's double edge. So clearly it's extremely exploitative, it can be, but it also provides opportunities to work in the private sphere for women who might not be able, we talked about the stigma of working in the public sphere. So that opportunity is also there, so it's sort of sort of that double-edged nature of it. So, given this larger context, the first sort of, I would really like you to comment on how do you see this, given you're looking at it through the lens of intersectionality, and particularly focusing on the importance of place here. And the reason I'm asking again is, and again you mentioned it briefly, I think earlier in your response to the previous question, but this idea of also then political mobilization, because increasingly we are seeing that unions are ineffective in this new economy, then increasingly where the mobilization is happening is really not on the shop floor of the factory, but really in the home and in the jhopata. So the nature of place then becomes important, and the relationship then with local service providers, with different intermediaries, with local government who might have nothing formally to do with, for instance, industry or a particular sector, say like, whatever the nature of the industry sector that otherwise you would be negotiating with. So if you can sort of comment on this in light of your framework.
Well, I wish I could, in the sense that I think all. I think it's not accidental, perhaps, as a I don't know whether it's, the question one often asks, why has paid domestic work finally come onto our agendas? And this, considering that we have a huge history of paid domestic work, and is it a kind of is it connected to the way in which internationally the care economy and the internationalization of migrant paid domestic workers from Sri Lanka to wherever, Denmark and so on, has become an international issue? Is there a kind of a way in which that has then made the paid domestic work question and unionization and so on in India an issue that we can tackle? Why have we not been able to find ways into thinking about all the things that you've talked about? I think there are particular industries, perhaps the BD industry or some few industries here and there, which have been on our agendas. But I'm not even sure that we have actually done very much in terms of the intersectional part of it. I don't think we have a picture of. I mean, I would look to you. I mean, since you're doing this kind of work, I would say you'd be in the best position then to name the nature of the problem. In other words, the bottom line of what I'm trying to do here is to say we need a better statement of the problem. See, very often we are sort of searching for the solution, we want the revolution to come, which it should. But I'm saying unless and until we have stated the problem better, what is it about the nature of that kind of labor, the sphere of the outside the shop floor situation, its localization in certain communities and so on. We know that that the labor of Muslim women is actually not low at all, but almost all Muslim labor is in the nature of home working. This is something that makes it so invisible, and yet it is paid labor, hyper exploitative, with very complex chains that are sometimes international chains. So what would it take to provide, I mean, I know it's not an answer from my side, I'm saying you need to do that kind of intersection management. To the extent to which anything that I've said might enable you to do that, then I think you might move forward. I think I'll close here.
Thank you, Professor John. It was such a wonderful talk. And the fact that despite all these interruptions from the electrical department and then the heat, all of us are here to listen to you. It's largely to your credit that you have been able to hold it together. And it also shows how much interest is generated by the concerns that you have been raised. And thank you very much, and we hope to sort of have you more with us for further sessions. Maybe we can have more detailed workshops, where we can devote a whole day for it without these our concerns. So thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody. We have to start the next session at 5:30 sharp. So what we'll do is we'll have tea after the next session. So you just had tea, so I'm receiving it.
And I hope the talk by Professor Kunyaman, I'm pronouncing correctly, right? Yeah, will be captivating enough to hold your attention for the next hour or so. I'm kind of briefly, so before before coming here, Professor Mundal just circulated to me a kind of brief write-up of about 5-6 pages of his talk, and I'm trying to introduce you to the talk on the basis of that. I am a professional economist by profession, mainstream economist by profession. So, but I'm interested in, I sort of dabble in economic history, position of women, how they are analyzed in economics, how, indigenous people, their problems are analyzed in economics. Some of my own working papers are analyzing those issues via the lens of game theory. I do it in a more technical, mathematical way, but I'm nevertheless interested in the problems and their evolution over time. So based on that, I'll just be talking of, I'll just take 5 minutes. So that's what Professor Mondal said, about 5-10 minutes of introduction. So the name suggests political economy. I think she announced changing contours. The leaflet that Professor Mondal had circulated says shifting contours. Anyway, shifting, changing, evolving contours. And, since contours sort of conjure up a landscape, a kind of picture, right? So I'll just start with, it's from one of the economic history books. It's a very nice line, and, just to make way into his talk. So the history of economic thinking may thus be used like a map or a landscape in which various schools of thought are located in different places, and where the objects of explanation form mountains, rivers, swamps, and jungles between those places. The most modern, currently dominating school may be located in a prominent place, providing a clear view over large parts of the ground from a high level, but in order to gain a full view of the objects of explanation, one may have to track the ways back to older schools of thought that yield different perspectives on them. The history of economic thought may furthermore help to find crossroads at which alternative routes of thinking could have been and can still be taken. It may thus provide some orientation not only on alternative ideas of the past, but also for promising directions of research in the future. So I'm hoping, I'm sure Professor Kuhneman's talk will really, guide us through this landscape and actually telling us, where the crossroads were, why some of the paths were taken and not others, and therefore give us an overview of, how the problems today are situated in the broad structure or matrix of economic history. So, typically economic history, if you pick up any book or you talk to anyone, so his economic history in thinking had been present from ancient times, right? From Aristotle, Plato, Kautilya in India. So all of these great thinkers would have talked of economic thoughts at times. But roughly modern economics dates from around 1770, about Adam Smith and so on. And at that time the predominant interest was interest in growth, development, cost of production, distribution of income between land, labor, capital. I think the talk will also talk about Ricardo and Marx, who actually was a classical economist in the sense of he critiqued this school, but he used the analytical tools of the classical economists. And what's very interesting is nearly all the works of that time, the books that they had written at that time had principles of political economy in the name. For example, the works of Malthus, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, or at least political economy in their titles, say Senior, James, Mill, and Marx. And the terminology kind of reflected the prevailing view that economics and politics were tightly interconnected, with politics playing a key role in determination of economic outcomes. Now, in modern times, I call myself a political economist, but I really don't know anything of Marx and others, right? So the connotation of political economy is very different now. So nowadays, it sort of denotes the subfield in mainstream economics, where economists use economic tools like game theory and stuff to analyze political problems. So, for example, my paper where I analyze, rights of tribals or some other issue of voting, taxation, for example, will also fall, it will also be called a political economy paper. Okay, but it's very different from what it used to mean always. So naturally, it evolved over time. So some classical tenets kept on. For example, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage was developed further by Heckscher, Olin, and so on. But around 1870, the more amorphous political and sociological factors that appeared less amenable for formal analysis were abstracted from and typically regarded as the subject of other social sciences. So economics kind of separated out with more mathematical, rigorous, scientific providing scientific ground to thoughts that were there. And typically it's the era of marginalism. Okay, the concept of marginal utility, marginal cost, marginal revenue, right? The analysis of calculus, first order conditions, and all of that started with in this age. And it kept on, Soros growth model 1950, Chamberlain, Robinson, and there's a host of others. So I'll just stop with saying that the current orthodox school or the dominant school, and the others are kind of referred to as heterodox schools on the fringes, is neoclassical economics, but it's likely, it's essentially a general toolkit out of which economics can select one or the other of analytical instruments for their purposes. For example, Becker, you may have heard of Gary S. Becker, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He used neoclassical tools of marginal utility, etc., to analyze the marriage market. For example, dowry arises in equilibrium in Becker's model, right? And there's a whole of other researches that's going on with using the neoclassical tools and modern tools of game theory and so on for studying land acquisition. For example, the bill that's very much topical today, there's a broad literature on economics of taking. How do you take land, right? What are the compensation? Why a fair compensation? Why not a full compensation? And what would those imply in economic terms, right? So, there are papers on surrogate motherhood, papers on Somalian pirates, right? So, what I'm saying is modern economics is very vibrant and very broad in its reach of many other disciplines, which you wouldn't have thought can be viewed through the lens of economics. So, I believe he'll tell much more about that. So,